grew up in rural Illinois, sort of middle of nowhere, 250 people and a cow type of Illinois. And I couldn't wait to get out, but the college I chose was, for me, an enormous city at the time. It was in Decatur, Illinois. It's Millikan University, liberal arts school. I wanted to go there to teach music. They had a great music program. And I quickly ran into many problems with that plan, not the least of which was I was far more interested in music and far more interested in teaching than I was in being certified to teach. The certification process for teachers is brutal, and there are a lot of loopholes. And so I quickly changed my major to writing. So from there, I went to Clemson University to get my master's degree in South Carolina, a school that seemed at the time like the most enormous thing on the planet. I think the town all in was 35,000 people, and the campus was about 11,000. So going from this town of 250 people, then to a small liberal arts school, which I thought was big, to this massive metropolis of Clemson, South Carolina. Um, it led me to some interesting paths, but it was a nice stepping stone in the sense that I didn't go right from this podunk city to Washington D.C. or New York or L.A., but it was a nice step up, slow step up.
Yeah, nice. So you wanted teaching, and then you specialize in writing, right? So you're a
Yeah.
writer. And how many times do you read things and they're just written terribly? I feel like writing has almost become more of a lost art than anything, right? Everyone just makes videos for stuff. People don't even read anymore, right? The aspect of picking up a book has become so obscure to some people, right? That they'll do, at least I'll hand it to the people for that are at least doing audiobooks that still like know that books have some value. They just don't want to go through the reading. But I feel like that's really a lost, that's becoming more of a lost art. And it kind of scares me, right? The moment people drop learning to write and write properly, that people can understand them.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Writing is becoming a lost art. Luckily for me, I had a professor who did something very good for me when I was young, because I thought I could write well when I was a freshman in college. And then I took this professor's class. His name was Brian Mim, very old school type of guy. And I turned in my first paper. I was so happy with it. And he handed it back to me. And I don't think there was a single sentence that wasn't marked up with grammatical error or spelling or awkwardness. And he wrote on it, great first college try, C minus. And what he did was he implemented this rule in his class of, I think he said something like, hey, we're all humans. The first grammar or spelling error you make in your paper, I'll mark it and then I'll move on. Won't affect your grade at all. The second one is a failed paper. And so that made you really stop and read your work very carefully. And here's where I think that's an incredible benefit. Writing as a form of communication is not just about communicating to others, honestly. I mean, that is primarily why we do it. But writing is a way for you to get clarity about what you think, because you have to choose words and they're, quote, permanent. You write them down, and they're in a sentence and they have to make sense. And so you have to really decide, what is it am I trying to communicate? Because usually you have a limited amount of space or a limited amount of time, and you can't just talk and ramble and keep throwing out words until someone finally gets what you're saying. You have to be really particular about it. So writing is as much a thinking exercise, in my opinion, as it is a communication exercise. So I wish more people would spend time studying the art.
Okay. Do you think the people that do write and spend time writing, right, and looking at the articulation behind what they're saying, oftentimes translate into better speakers, right? So now a huge thing in the world and a huge skill that's invaluable is you need to know how to talk to people and speak to people. We are in the age of communication, right? You communicate through various different forms. You're always on video. You're always talking to someone. So you really think that practice and that writing, whether it's writing a journal, writing like I do, short articles, writing a book, a memoir, whatever you think, do you think that translates super well into vocal communication?
It totally does, because of that clarity aspect. When we speak off the cuff, especially, we usually grab the first word that comes to mind. And that is sometimes a perfectly acceptable word to communicate what you're saying. But if you want to get really good at that, start writing things down before you say them. And I don't even necessarily mean you have to write it down and then memorize it and then say it. I just mean write down your thoughts that you generally want to talk about before you say them in sentence form, in paragraphs. You will be so better informed, so quicker on your feet, so much better to easily grab the words that actually communicate what you want to communicate, as opposed to the ones that accidentally communicate what you want to communicate. So certainly articles, books, whatever, I am a big fan of journaling. I think journaling is a fantastic way to, one, create that mental clarity that I'm talking about, but also to create some clarity about your feelings and what you're thinking about, and bring together ideas that maybe are floating around in your head, or you're sort of experiencing weirdness in your emotions and you don't really know what's going on. Start writing about it and start writing anything that comes to mind, and you'll start to get a lot of clarity on yourself really quickly.
Oh, definitely. I think that's huge. There's a current book I'm reading. You may have read it. Stumbling Upon Happiness or Stumbling on Happiness.
Hmm.
Um, and I haven't read the whole book, so I'm not going to act like I've read the whole book. But there's a certain point, in the beginning of the book where it talks about uh, how thoughts of the future and feelings are things that we can't control. And I think it's almost absurd. And I see this a lot, in a lot of young men and even older men, right? Uh, the containment and the inability to process those feelings, right? Because there's no no point in which they address them. A lot of people think addressing your feelings means talking to somebody. I think it does. It can't, and it does, and that's great to talk to somebody, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you're someone who's afraid of doing that, I think it's really important to do something like a journal entry and be able to, reflect upon yourself. I think a lot of people forget to reflect upon their own thoughts and feelings and try to process them. And writing, unlike speaking, right? Speaking, you can spew whatever you want to say, right? Writing,
Yeah.
you are, like you said, you're forced to slow down and think about it, right? You got to think about what you're putting next. I think that's huge. I think it's a great approach to helping people further develop their mental health and their feelings.
And there's a component there of honesty that I think should be emphasized, which is, unless you have just this incredible, outstanding relationship with the person you're talking to, you're going to put up some amount of barriers. You're going to choose words because you don't want to offend, or because you're embarrassed, or you don't feel like you can be vulnerable with this person. Maybe not. Maybe it's someone you're very comfortable with. But generally speaking, when you're journaling, or just don't even think about it as journaling, when you're just writing down your thoughts, there's not that barrier. Or if there is that barrier, try to explore it a little bit, because there's no one else there but you. There's just you, and you being honest with yourself and deciding what the words are that you're writing down. And if you're struggling with an emotion about work or about a relationship, and you write down a word and you think, that's not what I mean something 10 times as harsh as this, there's no one stopping you. There's no one but you to put down those words, and that you can reflect on them later and decide if they were quote right or wrong, end quote. But I think it's a great way to get access to yourself.
Right, and once you develop that access, it becomes easier to allow things. Right, when you're in the position of communicating with someone, I find myself more now since I've started writing, uh, pausing and realizing that a pause isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? And to show that you're processing information, or to be able, a lot of people are afraid to use the filler of, hey, that's a good question, let me think about that for a second, or let me get back. A lot of people are afraid to use those because we're forced culturally to believe that when there's a long period of silence, it becomes awkward and you want to fill it with something, right? That's
Yeah.
it's a huge negotiating tactic. Is if you think, like salaries, if you think you're not being offered enough, just don't say anything about it, and they will say something to fill that void, right? Because it becomes
Right.
awkward. And so that, I think, is huge, right? Being able to pause in your moment while you're speaking to articulate your thoughts.
I think that relates beautifully to the point about thinking and writing, and choosing the words. But just, I think the theme here so far is is reflecting and thinking, and being purposeful is another way to think about it. But yes, one of my dear friends, her name is Kira. She is the one who really taught this to me in our conversations, where I would say something or push back on a point, and she would say, "Give me a moment." and then take an actual moment, 3, 4, 5 seconds and think about it and then respond. And it became clear to me that that was an incredible value, and that I didn't need to being articulate doesn't necessarily mean having to be as quick as the next person. Being a good speaker and allowing for pauses and silence and contemplation, I think only adds to how profound it is that people believe you are. Steve Jobs was founder of Apple, was known for his silence in many ways, and someone similar to the tactic you were saying about negotiation, someone making a point to him and him just staring at them and then responding, and that just added to the legend of Steve Jobs and how incredibly smart he was. So stop, think, reflect, and then continue. Certainly.
People are gonna start hearing pauses and think the video stopped. Uh, do you think the way the American education system has been set up, it allows people to skate by, or scave? I don't know if scave is the correct word I'm looking for though. So I'm gonna go with skate by things where they don't have to write down and articulate, right? So like persuasion, when we think of persuasion, right? And I keep touching on this topic because I really enjoyed your article that you wrote about it.
Thank you.
Um, when you think persuasion, you think definitely you're influencing an audience, right? And you gave a couple different steps, and we'll dive into those later. But I think people too oftentimes, so someone like me, something I did a lot up until probably my later years of college, because in the later years, you really have to know what you're talking about. I winged 99% of my presentations up until that point. And because of those skills that maybe I wasn't persuasive and could make people believe, but in that moment, being charming and being, likable and being smooth with the way I talk, suave, as you would put it,
Yeah.
got me through in those moments.
Mhm. I
And
do think there's a point there about the education system. I don't want to, rail too hard
right,
on people who are trying, but sort of the way we have things set up now is very standardized, and it sort of it lends itself more to a can you meet these bare minimum requirements versus how do we get people to excel? How do we really get people to live a flourishing life? And that's unfortunate because it tends to be an averaging out type of thing with education where, yeah, we will bring some of the worst off up a little bit, but we're also going to bring some of the best down a bit. So we're going to have much more of an average. I think there is room to rethink how we do education in the United States. I certainly think that what we went through in 2020 and continue to go through in this year with COVID and distance learning is an opportunity to rethink education, and I encourage everyone to do that. I will say, partially on the point about skating through, the element of writing too is an element of standards. And so, yes, we do engage in writing in things like text messaging, instant messaging, uh, sort of short form things like that. I think there you really have to hold yourself to a particular standard if you want to get better at it. And it's perfectly appropriate to send back, K, if that's what the response is or whatever. That's I'm not trying to say you need to write out Shakespearean poetry in a response to a quick question, but the idea being that don't let that become the norm of your thinking habits as they apply in writing. So take it seriously, write things down, and hold yourself to a high standard in that regard. No system will be suited to someone who just simply does not hold themselves to a high standard, whether it's for writing, speaking, living, period.
I think you're correct. I think you're 100% correct. A lot of people forget, a lot of people use the outer world as their standard, right? Well, this
Right.
person's doing that. This person's good at this. Well, this person isn't as good as that. And that's where I think your averaging aspect comes into play, right? We all, the best, look around and go, well, that guy's not as good as me. So I can, for lack of better words, dumb it down in a sense.
Yep.
And the low look at it and go, well, since this guy dropped it down, we're almost the same. So there's no point for me to keep trying to get up above that level. And that's really where, again, you see the averaging come in. There's no challenge. You know, you are your best and worst critic when it comes to it. Now, what do you think if so? Like, if I was to critique myself on writing or speaking, we'll do both, right? Because I think they're very different dialects, right? I
Mhm.
talk way different than I write.
Sure.
Um, what do you think are the 5 things that are a necessity to be a great writer, and then the 5 things that are a necessity to be a great speaker? And if they overlap, go ahead and say that. I don't want you to have to repeat yourself, but I think it's very important. I think a lot of people really like to hear, you know, what it takes to be that. I think everyone's trying to get there.
Yeah. So I think the first one for both um, is you have to know yourself. And part of what I mean by this is I come at persuasion from a slightly different angle. So persuasion is typically taught as this thing that we do to other people. And that's fine. I mean, obviously, we do have to engage in persuading other people, and that's for good reason. But the way to actually be particularly good at persuasion is first and foremost to know what it is that you think yourself. And the problem is that most people don't take the time to do that. They grasp onto something, some idea, some whatever, the what the majority think, what the current culture is, what might be woke at the moment. They just grab onto it and say, this is the thing I have to persuade people of. And they've never really considered it for themselves. So, the first thing in order to be a good writer or a speaker, just a good communicator in general, is to understand yourself. What are your values? What is it that you are trying to advocate for and why? For you, first and foremost. And by the way, that will also make you a much more effective persuader because you will be genuine. People that will exude from you if that is what you genuinely believe.
Right.
So, first and foremost, know yourself. Um, the second, which also might be applicable to both, I'll think about it as I'm saying it, is also related to sort of knowing the craft. So if you really want to dedicate yourself to writing and speaking, read a book on writing, watch some videos of people who are great speakers, dedicate yourself to exploring those out there who do the craft well. Be be a student of that which you want to excel at. So go and not only with speeches are you watching people deliver speeches, but go read some of the great speeches in history and see why they were the great speeches in history. Go watch video or read transcripts of Martin Luther King Jr. or read the Gettysburg Address or uh, one that I recently rediscovered. I think from a commercial, and then I went back and watched the full thing. Was John F. Kennedy's "We're Going to the Moon" speech. It is shocking how good some of these people were. But in order to be good yourself, you need to digest what is good. So continue to do that. Third, certainly for writing, would be to practice and to make sure that you don't allow mistakes, where you don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good, no matter what you do, but writing especially. You are going to start off fairly bad. Sorry. That's just how it is. And you need to keep writing. And in fact, you need to keep writing in some, if you want to do this and you want to do it well, is what I'm talking about, maybe as a profession or as
Right.
something to enhance your career, whatever, you need to also do it in some public manner. Now, I'm not saying you need to publish everything you write on the internet, but have a group of friends who you're comfortable with sharing your writing and have them give you feedback. And I don't mean grammar and whatever, maybe, but what I mean is simply what is their reaction to it? And make sure you can trust these people to do that. I guess speaking is somewhat related to that. You do need to go out and speak, and you're again probably going to be bad at it when you start. Um, but there are instances with speaking that's different where you can do it in a much smaller group, in a much more low risk setting, where you can do it in a way that it might be mildly uncomfortable, and then you can sort of turn up the discomfort as you get better and better and better at it. But do it. Actually, get out there and practice it. I think that's 3 for each.
That is.
But I think those are good starting points. I think there's other things where you dive in, studying the discipline where you're actually reading. When you want to get advanced, you can start reading about different methods for both of these things. Throughout history, people have studied writing and they've studied the art of speaking. It's called the field of rhetoric. You can look it up and start reading, what people like Aristotle wrote about writing and speaking, thousands of years ago. And what's incredible is that so much of it is still applicable to this day. They were pretty smart back then. Um,
Well, that
so I think we'll leave it there. But
the main form of communication, they were almost creating the way to communicate, right? And now we're just trying to advance it. I think three is a great number. And I will say, to your first point, you talk about how you need to understand yourself. And I think that's important. And to almost simplify that concept, I think it's a lot about having a control, right? You need to start
sure,
somewhere. And if you can't start with yourself, what are you doing, right? Like if you don't have a starting point to a race, when does the race end? No one knows. That's where people start rambling and going on and have no end means to their end, right? And
yeah,
so that's why I think it's huge about what you said, knowing yourself, because it always gives you a starting point, no matter what, whatever you're arguing, talking about, have interest in, writing about. If you know your own morals and values and interest, you can then reflect upon those. No matter what, you can always go back to them. And the second point, you talk about how um, these famous speeches, right? And I think there's one thing that is almost similar in all these speeches that I think a lot of people forget about, and why on my website I'm a firm believer in almost um, you know tidbits of information, right? I give a flash 600 words, boom boom, right? um, all those are concise.
hmm
Gettysburg Address, JFK's speech, Martin Luther King's speech. They're all concise to their topic. And I don't mean concise as in, oh, they're only 10 minutes long, right? But they never trailed off. He never once paused in the middle of a speech and was like, by the way, America is great. There was never,
who does that?
yeah, I wonder. There's never any of that. They are concise to the topic.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And then I think that goes back to knowing yourself and what your values are and what you want to communicate, which is you can go into a situation thinking, okay, well, what exactly is it that I need to get out here? What exactly do I want to tell people? And then you don't need to go any further because that's what you've communicated. Um, I think the conciseness part also speaks to what we were talking about earlier about clarity. When things tend to run on, it is usually a sign that people aren't particularly clear, either what they believe, what they know, or what they want to communicate. And all three of those things I think are necessary. So, what is it that I actually value here? What do I actually understand about the topic that I'm either speaking about or writing about? And then what of that do I want to tell other people? And it should be a smaller and smaller subset until there's something very particular that you're looking to communicate.
And I think, yeah, and I think that really falls back upon um, people get it in their heads that they consistently need to lay out all the evidence to convince something, right? But
Right.
at a certain point, you've already either convinced them or not, right? There's that spectrum. People you can convince can convert who are already convinced, and people you will never convince. And they're always, I feel like everyone's trying to strive for the people you can never convince.
Sure.
And I think and that's where your clarity gets lost, right? You're spewing a million and one facts about a topic when you might have had them at the first fact. And I think that's where like I said, clarity comes in. If I'm going to argue or say my point speaking to you is that the sky is green, I shouldn't say the sky is green because this and that, and I don't know if you guys knew this, but it was also green because of this. And when I was, it actually turned green during this year. I don't need to say that, right? The sky is green. If you don't believe me, oftentimes the question will arise, well, why is the sky green? And
hmm
then maybe I give you an answer, right? The sky is green because it reflects the vegetation from the ground.
Right.
Okay, well, why doesn't, then you might have an opposition, and then it's almost built in stages, right? So I'm going to have some people at the sky is green. I'm going to have some people at the reflection of vegetation, right? And then I'm going to have some people, which are your people that are going to be very hard to convince, maybe not impossible, that want to know, well, why isn't this true? And what more do you have to back your argument? And I think that's really, where that clarity comes in and knowing who you're addressing.
Totally. Knowing your audience is incredibly important. Knowing what their context is, knowing what you do agree on, for instance. And so I think there are lots of things to talk about here. I think one of the, well, I'll give you two big misconceptions about persuasion, in my opinion. The first big misconception is that other people are robots. And if I just press the right rhetorical buttons, I will have programmed them and they will be persuaded. The end. And so the art of rhetoric, the art of persuasion just becomes figuring out your series of buttons to press. Well, it turns out that humans aren't robots. They're wonderfully complex creatures.
Believe this
And
part. I'm just
yes.
kidding.
And persuasion often doesn't happen in a particular moment. And what I mean by that is, unless it's something where it's like, I'm trying to convince you that we're going to go to Applebee's for dinner versus TGI Fridays, you're rarely going to see the outcome of persuasion in any one argument. Now, sometimes you only have access to someone for one argument, and the best you can do is sort of the metaphor of planting a seed and just hoping that it grows, that this person takes care of it, and they decide, yes, this person was right in the long run. But honestly, the most persuasion that we do in our lives actually occurs with the people around us who, one, we see as values to ourselves, and those who see us as a value to them, to themselves. And part of the reason for this is something Aristotle talked about, going back to Aristotle, always going back to Aristotle, which is that one of the most fundamentally important elements of persuasion is what he called ethos, or character. Is the person speaking of goodwill, and do they have my best intentions at heart? They're not trying to pull something over on me. They're not trying to manipulate me or sell me a bill of goods. They really have my best interest at heart, and they're a good person. And honestly, he says, you could have the best argument in the world. It could be logically sound. It could be emotionally appealing. If someone thinks you are a charlatan, they're not buying what you're selling. Period.
I think that's
So
great. I think I want to say something right there because I think it goes
yeah,
along with something that I practice. I don't think is common. And one of the things I practice when it comes to persuasion, or when I was starting out, for someone who maybe isn't a persuasive person, right? It's not a great speaker that doesn't go up there with a goal set in mind. The biggest way you can see if you can persuade people and know that you have the knack is we do it every day to ourselves, right?
yeah,
When you tell yourself this pizza won't hurt me, right? It won't gain me those pounds. It's good for me. You, for some reason, when arguing with yourself or persuading yourself, come up with all the best arguments to convince yourself.
sure.
And why do you believe it? Because it's coming from you, right? Who do you trust most in this world other than yourself? And so, like, I think that's huge to what you're saying right now. That's why I wanted to say it because, right, you have to believe the person's coming from. So there's a starting point. You're always going to believe yourself. So if you don't want to persuade, try to just be mindful of it through your day. What do you catch yourself persuading to do?
Yep.
And then from there, don't ever think you can't structure that argument because you found a way to structure it to buy yourself pizza. You found a way to convince yourself in my case, to move across the country, right? And so yeah, I think that's a very good starting point for people and to kind of go off of what you said.
That's a very astute point. I have a good friend, Don Watkins, who does communications for a living as well. And one of the things that he often says in thinking about persuading other people is related to exactly what you identified, which is, how did you come to the point where you are? How did you decide that X, Y, and Z is right, or that you should vote for whomever? And then try to backtrack a bit, figure out what was it that brought you there. And there are sometimes two different conclusions. One is you have thought about it and there are good arguments and you can use them. The other is you don't know and it becomes a little scary. Well, I believe something and I don't actually know how I believe it anymore. but it's a good exercise nonetheless. Um, I just want to finish off one point from earlier. I said there were two big misconceptions. The second big misconception, so the first being that persuasion happens instantly, but the second big misconception is that everyone is persuadable. It's not true. There's a concept in persuasion called a real audience. And a real audience is, first of all, someone who is even open to hearing ideas, open to hearing something new. And it turns out that a large majority of people, at least on certain issues, are not open to it. And so in those instances, you are arguing with essentially a brick wall. And it might be a fun game, but you're not actually engaging in persuasion. You're mostly just wasting some energy. That might be fun for you, but it's not for me. So I do try to go and identify the people who I think are actually persuadable, if that's a possibility. And the second element of audience is that they're able to do something about it. And sometimes that means that we're oddly engaging in arguments that don't go anywhere. So a really bizarre example of this might be, trying to convince someone to change the weather. Well, they might be convinced that they should change the weather, but they can't change the weather. Now, when we're going to more like political things aside, it might be like convincing someone to advocate for a specific position, but they might say, look, I can't do that right now because my family would disown me, and I'm just not in the position to do that. And you have to have a lot of empathy with that, but they're also not a real audience for you. So persuasion doesn't happen instantly, and not everyone is persuadable. And if you let those two things sink in, I think you'll have a lot easier time and a lot less stress when you're thinking about advocating for a position or persuading people.
Now, you talk about identifying your audience, right? And you touch on, I would love to go into this a little bit more because I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with. And a lot of people just don't know the right people to talk to. And then also learning to present themselves in a way that those people want to believe you. So I think, there's a huge thing I say that's, a lot of it's doing it and then believing in yourself. Well, I think when it comes to speaking, it is doing it, but actually I think people have to, know prior to when you speak, you have to have some ounce of them that's like, I think it's a believable person. I think what they have to say is correct, right? And so, how do you build that up for yourself pre-speech, pre-public speaking, and then from there be able to identify your groups to speak to?
Excellent question, and something that everyone deals with at any level. Even professional communicators deal with this topic, and it is not an easy one. But I have some, I think, some solid advice for anyone, novice or advanced. So first and foremost, when you're thinking about audience, we tend to think about the word audience in this huge abstraction. And we can think about it as like, oh, I want to speak to young people, or I want to speak to Republicans, or I want to speak to stamp collectors. Any of those things I think are actually too broad for you to think about as an audience and too abstract. It doesn't really mean that much because within any of those groups, you could have people with wildly different values and wildly different desires and wildly different things that they need to hear in order to be persuaded. So one tactic that I tend to use when I'm writing something or when I'm presenting a speech is thinking about how in any way can I just narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow this audience to, man, if I can do it, thinking about the one person I want to talk to and what this person is like. There's a concept that I'm stealing from design, specifically from what's called user interface design, where a designer has to figure out how someone literally is going to use an app or a website. And what they do is they create personas that are fake individual people. And they say, so one of the users of this website is going to be David. And David is a 65-year-old newly retired teacher who really loves puppies but he needs really big font because he has bad eyesight and whatever, whatever, whatever. And you try to be as granular as possible, and you try to do things like, what are the things that are going to cause David frustration? What are the things that are going to cause David to applaud our efforts? What are the things that are going to cause David to continue to use the website? And you do this for 3 or 4 people. And what happens is when you're designing things, that really concrete step helps you think, well, if I put a button here, David's going to be really annoyed because it's just going to get in the way of the text. And all he's here for is the text. So maybe we figure out how to put the button somewhere else. Or Julia, yeah, she really needs this to be easily shareable because she's a big sharer with her family. So we need social media buttons or whatever it is. Take that concept in your communication and try to figure out who it is, the 1, 2, or 3 people you're actually talking to, and think about them as real human beings, because that's how persuasion operates. Persuasion doesn't operate to this mass stadium level crowd. It really doesn't. It operates on an individual human being basis, one-on-one. That's how it works. Even if you're talking to 10,000 people, you need to make some form of connection with the individuals there. So how is it that you make connections with large groups of
Right.
people? Because that can be an entirely different challenge. And honestly, if I had the magic roadmap there, I'd be much richer than I am today. So take this advice for what it's worth. Um, I think in order to build an audience, you need to build this goodwill that I'm talking about. And you need to be able to show people that you are a good person worthy of being listened to, and 2, that you have their best interest at heart. Now, I'm going to pause to say this, and sometimes it goes without saying, but I really want to say it, which is you need to actually mean it. I don't mean figure out a way to fake it. I mean actually be a good person. I mean actually have your audience's best will at heart. Um, just thought I needed to say that. Uh, and how you begin to do that is, again, I want to give credit to Don Watkins, who formulates it this way, is he says, how can you be a value to other people? Now, part of how we are not a value to other people is if we're constantly asking them for things. So I think one of the big mistakes that people make when they're starting to build an audience is they're asking for, quote, sales too soon, whatever that means. Sign up for my newsletter or support me on Patreon or whatever it is.
Right.
First and foremost, be of value. Tweet interesting things, find valuable articles, say interesting things, say helpful things, point people in directions they wouldn't have seen before. Make sure that they're seeing what you're seeing in terms of value. And then and only then can you just start to creep in sales type things. And then you just need to do that over and over again so that you are engaging people to bring one more person in. And again, if you're thinking about persuasion as a one-on-one, so is sales, so is growth. It's a one-on-one, one-by-one thing. You're never or rarely going to just have 1,000 people sign up for your newsletter all of a sudden. It's going to be one by one by one by one by one by one. And hopefully that network effect builds, but it's from these people essentially understanding your value, believing in your character and your ethos, and bringing them on individually.
I think you're 100% correct. And I think a lot of people struggle with, and I'll even admit I struggled with it when I first started my website. It's the patience aspect of it, right? When doing one by one by one by one, it doesn't, no matter how good you are, it doesn't happen overnight. You can't during that day go one by one by one. It doesn't, right? And so badly, I think, when you think of people that build apps and build websites like I did, that first month or two, you're like, why isn't it, taking off? Well, why don't people like it, right? You constantly are asking yourself, how do I get more people? How do I get more people? And eventually it almost takes a rewinding effect in yourself, right? Okay, maybe I need to stop asking how do I get more people and start asking how do I provide more value to,
Mm,
right? And
yes.
so I think that's something that's left out. And I think that was huge for me. My first 3 months was way definitely about how do I get more people? How do I start doing this? How do I start doing that? And it never once stopped and asked myself, well, how do I bring these people value? How do I, instead of, much like fishing, right? How do I provide them with something, dangle a worm, dangle some food, provide them with something to where they want to stay.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely.
yeah, and I think that's always forgot about and people jump the gun too early. Now, persuasion is a topic within its own, but I think a lot of people have in general just a trouble with communicating.
Hmm.
And so one of my favorite books, and maybe you've read it or not, it's How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale
Absolutely.
Carnegie. And there are some persuasion tactics in it, obviously. Uh, but when looking at that book, what skills, you don't have to go by the book. The book is great, right? I recommend anyone reading it. It was one of my very first self-help books that I read, and I've reread it since then. I have highlights all through it. It's a great book. It's well structured. Um, what do you really think just become a good communicator? And again, what bring value to people? You talk about it in a couple of your articles, right? Listening with conviction and
Ooh,
concern,
yeah.
and then being able to reiterate something that allows them, a question that allows them to continue to talk about themselves. Yes or no's are dangerous, right? So how do you become that better communicator?
Yes, totally. The communication element that I think is more important than anything else is actually what you identified, the ability to listen. Listening is, as his writing, I think, somewhat of a lost art. Uh, Maybe it's social media, I don't know, but we tend to all broadcast now. We tend to just constantly push out messaging, and forget that the social element of social media is that there's supposed to be talking back and discussion and whatever. But we bring that to our real lives now, which is very unusual. But listening is the number one way to become a better persuader. Listening is the number one way in a one-on-one situation to build ethos. One of the core concepts here is called visibility. I think I think it comes from psychology. It might have different roots, but that's how I came to it. And the idea here is that every individual has this yearning to be seen, and to be seen kind of psychologically, more like you get me, man, like you really see me, right? Like not literally, but. And so listening to someone, picking up on cues, yes, restating something that they said so that they know that you're listening, but then also not making it about you, not making it about what you're getting out of this conversation, but about being of value to them in the conversation. And sometimes, and by the way, men are particularly bad at this, they want to offer advice because we tend to think that advice is valuable. And if there's a problem, we must solve it. If there's a nail, we must hammer it, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes the biggest value you can present to someone is simply saying, or thinking, I've listened, and then saying, that sucks. Or if it's happy, good for you. That's fantastic. And not trying to solve something or give advice. And then one sort of quasi advanced tactic there is start again, genuinely caring about people, especially the people you're trying to persuade, and bring things back from previous conversations or even from earlier in a conversation, making sure that they know that you have not only listened, but you've integrated and now you're bringing it back to them. That is a key way to make people feel visible. Visibility is one of the number one ways that lead to character and ethos building.
And it can even come down to as simple as remembering someone's name.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's huge. I know in How to Win Friends talks about it a lot, right? I can't remember. It might have been Teddy Roosevelt, but he would remember every person. It might have been FDR too. I'm not. Don't quote me on it. I know it's in the book.
Yeah.
Um, you remember every person's name they ever met because he realized the importance that those people felt as if they actually met him and he actually reciprocated meeting them, right? And that's something that, I can't tell you how many times I probably called people bro or sir or this or that because I don't remember their name. And it is challenging, right? You said to yourself in your articles, humans only remember 25% of what they hear.
Right.
But because of that, and I think that's a fact that we may not be able to quantify in our heads, without reading it, obviously, but we all subconsciously have an understanding of it, right? So we all know within ourselves that, oh, not everyone, I don't remember everything. I know they don't remember everything. So being able to come back and be like, hey, I talked to you a couple months. How's this going? How are you
Right.
doing this? Becomes an invaluable skill, right? It separates you from, you know, anyone else that they've met. And that's where you start developing, I think, those skills and that almost that reputation of
Hmm.
being a caring individual and being a good-hearted individual, whether you are or not, right? And I think that's really a great place to start if we go back to what we were talking about earlier. How, you need to make people believe you are good by actually doing good. I think that's something that people don't think of as a good thing, but it is. Whether, hey, I heard your mother was sick. How is she doing? How is that whole situation, right?
Yeah,
Maybe the topic itself isn't good, but the fact that you asked, you know, that's huge.
absolutely. And it'll rarely be that we can do this for everyone we meet, but let's think about it, as we were saying, in particular of the people you care about and the people you're interested in persuading. Three really practical things on this specifically on names or about remembering things. So one is I'm fairly bad at remembering names because I'm a bit more of a visual learner than I am an audio learner. So I forget where I picked this up, but one of the techniques is when you meet someone and you're shaking their hand or elbow bumping them now in the age of COVID, um, take a moment and look at their shoulder and visualize a name tag with what they said. Like if they said their name is Curtis, look at their shoulder and think there's a name tag here. It says, "Hello, my name is Curtis." That works about 95% of the time for me. It's not 100%, but it's made me exponentially better at remembering people's names. Two, practical point here. If you have forgotten someone's name, it is better to use a phrase, hang a lantern on it early in the conversation and just apologize and say, I know we met, and see if you can come up with some other thing.
Yeah.
I know we met, I know we talked about your mom, but I sincerely apologize. I've forgotten your name. Can you remind me? And that allows you to be vulnerable in the moment. And most of the times that vulnerability will make up for the fact that you've forgotten someone's name. The worst thing you can do is pretend, and then you're 30 minutes into the conversation and you still don't know this person's name. And now you're trying to find a way out of it, and it's anxiety inducing. And the third practical thing is many people who are good at this are good because after they have the conversation, they write it down. They actually keep notes. Again, you're not going to keep notes about every stranger you meet, but about people you genuinely care about and genuinely want to follow up with, people you genuinely want to persuade. It's perfectly fine to jot down a note. And there are apps that do this now too. You know, Curtis, Man Meets Modern podcast, uh, moved to Oakland. And then I can, when we talk again, I can say, have you gotten to experience more of Oakland? But it helps you, and then you can refer to this again when you're meeting with them. So
Definitely. I think there's something super valuable about what you said just there, and that would be to not not go 30 minutes into the conversation without acting like you do know the name. I've gotten one too many drinks poured on me because of that. um, but really coming up with something to show them that, hey, I did listen to you, though. I do remember talking to you. And I think that's translatable to multiple parts of communication, right? I think I do that a lot in interviews, right? Like if I forget something, always have something to come back with. Oh, I may not have an answer for you on that, but I do have an answer for you on this, which I know you're looking for, right? Or like you said, oh, I can't remember your name, but I do remember you're not actually from, Tennessee, you're from Florida and moved here, right? And like
Yep.
having those actionable facts and then writing it down is, top notch, right? That's where you take that time and write it. But you're right, that becomes more of you knowing your audience. Am I going to need to remember this person's name in the future, right? Do they provide me some value, surpassing just being a casual acquaintance? And, and that's why, like, making friends is a little different, right? Because I think every friend becomes a casual acquaintance, and then you eventually just become friends due to mutual interest. Whereas when you're using communication persuasion skills, you have a target, right? And I don't want to make it sound weird, but you do, right? You do have a target. You have a target
Yeah,
on someone, on what you want and what you need from that person. You're trying to satisfy a need with that person, so it becomes invaluable for you to write that down.
absolutely. I'll give you one more advanced tactic that is related to this. I write a little bit about this in my article, Being Charming. But when you genuinely start to care about people and listen to them and figure out what it is that their values are, you start to have a pool of people for whom this is true. One of the biggest ways, now there's some danger, but one of the biggest ways to really gain ethos with these people, to really make it so that your character is clear, is to make introductions. To say, this person has this value, this person has a similar value. I would like to make sure these people meet each other and know each other. That can go an incredibly long way to building your audience, to building your value to people, to showing that you genuinely listen and care and have their best interest at heart. And whether that's they've connected because of a potential friendship or because they both love rare bourbon whiskeys, or maybe there's a business venture to be had. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you were thoughtful enough to take these two people who were disconnected and connect them. The warning, of course, is that doing this poorly can have the opposite effect. And you should not connect people just for the heck of it or because of some arbitrary value, like they both have red hair or something. Doesn't work. I promise. It's not the same thing.
Sounds like the blind dates you get set up on, right? Oh, I think you
Yeah.
both like each other. You're both like both 7 out of 10s, like something so arbitrary, right? That someone sets you up and you just have zero interest within that person. And
Yeah.
even that, right? So everything we've said, I think, plays on one of the things you talked about earlier, and that's I know I already reiterated to it once, but I'm gonna do it again because I think it's important. Uh, and that's allowing people to believe you're a good person, right? And I think right there is another way you can do that. Your ability to set people up and make sure that they enjoy each other's company allows them to entrust in you more with anything, right? If you're able to introduce me to someone that I know I'm gonna like, I trust your value and opinion more.
Totally. And I know we're in the age of COVID now, and this is more difficult, but doing it over email or electronic text, whatever, is fine. If you can do it in the room, where people can have an immediate conversation, it is this incredibly stellar experience. Um, it's rare, and you shouldn't push it. You shouldn't try to make it happen. But the point is, the face-to-face interaction, especially with that moment of Curtis, I really think you should meet Justin. You two both host podcasts. I think you have a lot in common. Whatever the value is, you know,
Right.
let me get you a beer while you two catch up. Uh, yeah,
Definitely. Yeah. And so, you know, I guess when it comes down to it, if I was to bring you someone today, right? And I sat him here, let's say Joe Schmo, right? The most common fake name in the world, Joe Schmo. And I sit Joe Schmo in front of you right now. And I go, Joe Schmo is the worst public speaker, nay, communicator in the world. Where would you tell him to start to better that?
to circle this back somewhat to the beginning, you first and foremost have to start with you, yourself, And there are many ways you can do that. Obviously, first and foremost, figuring out what it is that you value and what it is you want to communicate, what it is that you have some passion to communicate. Because none of us are, I should say it this way. Some of us do have to do communication as part of our job or part of our whatever, and there are ways to get better at that. I think what I'm talking about in particular is being a communicator of your values, whether that's philosophy, politics, music, art, whatever, your values.
I'm sorry. I know
Mhm.
values are coming up, Daniel. And I want to reiterate, I want to say something to people because I know in the beginning we talked about the five most important things as a speaker and a writer. I want people to know the distinct difference of what I'm talking about right
Sure.
now. I don't want them to think that I'm trying to repeat myself.
Mhm.
Uh, Earlier, you know, five, those are very specific things to becoming a great writer and speaker.
Yep.
What I am referring to now for those that are listening is what can you do? What actionable things can you do to become better, right? Is it like you said, and we've touched on a couple of them, maybe speak in front of your friends or anything like that. But if you have never communicated a day in your life, what would you do? And
Gotcha.
that's really the point I'm getting at. And so I just wanted to clarify that because I know some listeners might think, oh, he's just going over stuff again. I don't want that to be a thing.
Understood. And I will give some really concrete things you can do. I'm mostly reiterating that this values point and knowing yourself is applicable to the person who's going to speak for the first time and the person who has given 10,000 campaign speeches. It really, that element of it is so fundamentally important that it never changes. It doesn't change for me, it doesn't change for anyone. So knowing what it is that you are passionate about and that you want to communicate. But here's some really concrete things you can do, especially because one of the number one reasons we don't communicate is you can call it stage fright or fear of public speaking or public anxiety, social anxiety. You will never be more afraid than when you are literally staring yourself in the mirror, deadlocked, and trying to talk to yourself, especially about something very honest about yourself. Do that. Do it in the comfort of your home, no one around you, no recording, nothing. But talk to yourself eye to eye. Do not break eye contact in the mirror and tell yourself whatever it is that you want to communicate. But if you can do that, then you can take the next step of talking to someone else because I promise you, you will be so much more comfortable talking to someone else after you have really given yourself the what for in a mirror. I promise.
You're right. And I know I said it earlier, you are your best and worst critic, right? If you're going to sit there and talk to yourself, you're going to tell yourself when you sound like an idiot, right? When you're like,
Yep.
you just sound ridiculous. And that's why it's a weird thing. People feel uncomfortable doing because they believe it's weird, right? If someone's to open the door and look at me talking to myself in the mirror and be like, dude, do you not have friends? Do you not like, you know, but it's important, right? And it
Yeah.
comes back to knowing yourself. Now, Daniel, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just have one more thing, and then
Go ahead.
and that is the sort of bridge I think to communicating to other people is we actually have a phenomenal. We're in a phenomenal era of the internet, obviously, but the element here that allows can really help in the communications realm is anonymity. Now that goes against all the things we've talked about with character and building an audience and whatever. To some degree, it might not, but to a lot of degree, it does. But use the anonymity of the internet to overcome some anxieties if that's the problem you have. Start a Twitter account that's anonymous and start giving opinions. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out and be a troll or a bad person or any of those things.
Yeah,
I'm
be
just
careful
saying,
what you say.
do be careful what you say. I'm just saying it's a way to practice opinion giving in a way that's safe in the sense that no one knows it's you. um, I think then you should make the next step of owning your opinions and owning what it is you're trying to persuade people of. I think that's incredibly valuable for the same reasons that anonymity is important. Sort of the opposite reasons are why you should put your face on those opinions, which is it helps build character, it helps build ethos. Um, but that's a nice bridge to doing that, I think. So those are the two.
Awesome. That's great. So, Daniel, it is time for our Man Meets Modern Crazy Things. So for those of you that might be new and don't know, and for you, because I know I love dropping it because it makes it more genuine. Uh, to connect us and know that everyone is human and has fun in their life and does, whatever they do. What is the craziest thing you've ever done?
Oh boy, the craziest thing I have ever done. I got to think about not censoring myself here, so that I'm very genuine,
Yeah.
but also choose something that will not get me fired should I someone listen to the podcast. No, I've got a really good one because it's one that I'm particularly proud of, and it's localized but it feels like it's out of a movie. And so here it was. When I was dating my who would become my wife, the woman who would become my wife, we had a period where we broke up, and then a period where we got back together, but we weren't exclusively dating. I wanted to be exclusively dating. She did not. So she was out on a date with someone else. Okay. And she was texting me. And so I figured out by context clues where she was. And I went and crashed their date as just like I'm randomly walking in here. Now, that's not that crazy. As we were all walking out to the parking lot, remember, they're on a date. This guy doesn't know I exist.
Right.
I grab her by the waist and kiss her in front of this guy, like passionate, like we are exclusive kiss. And then I do the have a good night to him, and I walk away. I go back to my car and head home.
He said, drop mic and let's hurry up and get out of here before I get my ass kicked.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's crazy for me. I'll say that I don't live the most adventurous life in the universe, but that was for me. That was a fun moment.
That's awesome. And now you are married, right? Or
Yes,
yeah,
yes, we are married now. Have been married since 2016. So
yeah, there you go. Sometimes you just got to make the move.
yep.
Well, I've had a great time with you here, Daniel. Where can people find you?
Sure, you can find some of my writing at my website, which is Daniel T. Richards with an s.com/writing, or just go to danieltrichards.com and you can find it there. You can find me on Twitter at the exact same handle, at Daniel T. Richards, because I own my opinions.
Awesome. Yeah, I love the tagline. And we will be putting the website in the link or in the description. So for those of you that may not remember that for some reason, it will be in the description. So go ahead and look at it. Daniel, I appreciate you so much for coming on the cast today in the Man Meets Modern cast. You were a great guest.
Thanks for having me, Curtis. It was a blast.
It's a great fucking day.